Yeah, hi, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. Hi to Isha and Paul. My name, as you heard, is Neil Stevens. I'm based at Brunel University, London, and I'm involved in a group called Cultivate. And I'm holding together, chairing, moderating, but also engaging in this discussion with the rest of the panel. We've been asked to talk about the history of cellular agriculture, something we're all very interested in. You can talk about how lengthy is the history of cellular agriculture. There might be more than you think. We'll look forward to talking about that. First of all, perhaps I'll get the three of us to all introduce ourselves. As I said, my name is Neil Stevens. I'm primarily a social scientist. I'm a sociologist, and I've been looking primarily at cultured meat, more so than some of the other cellular agriculture instances, for a long time, since about 2008. I study from a sociological perspective the emergence of the technology and the community of people who are producing the technology. As I said, I'm also a co-founder of Cultivate, which is something I'll be talking about tomorrow, which is a UK multi-voiced forum for discussing cellular agriculture. Perhaps Isha, I mean, everyone knows you, but perhaps for the, the new people.
Yeah, my name is Isha. I'm Executive Director of New Harvest. My history with cellular agriculture probably goes back only 11 years. Neil, I'm sure you probably go back 13, 14, maybe more.
12.
Anyway, I'm very excited to be on this panel today. Just to give a little bit of an intro for those who aren't familiar, New Harvest is the longest running nonprofit organization focused on cellular agriculture, or the growth of food products like meat, milk, and eggs from cell cultures rather than whole animals. And we are deeply focused in supporting research, especially academic research at universities. So very excited to be chatting about this topic today, and I'll pass it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Isha. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Alex and Anita and all of the organizers at CMS20. It's a real pleasure and honor for all of us to be at this conference, and we have a lot of gratitude to you for persevering through the pandemic and still holding this extremely useful conference. So you might not hear all the people listening to this applauding you, but you can hear Neil, Isha, and myself applauding.
Yes. And I got my mug. It's not exactly a CMS mug, but an adjacent organization mug.
Well, I do want to point out that you may have come prepared with your Cultured Meat podcast swag, Isha, but I have come prepared with my New Harvest cultured meat mask. I'm very proud. I'm very proud to, I believe, been the first non-New Harvest employee to actually have one of these things, thanks to the kindness of both Isha and Mira. So thank you both. Anyway, hi, I'm Paul Shapiro. I am the CEO of a company called The Better Meat Co. I also am the author of the national bestseller called Clean Meat: How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. That book is now been translated into about 10 other languages. It's selling throughout Asia and Europe, and of course still the United States. And if you want a complimentary copy, the very first person to email me your address will get a complimentary copy signed to you. So you can go to cleanmeat.com, and I'll happily send you one copy to the very first person who emails me your snail mail address to get it. So I'm really excited to talk about the history of cellular agriculture, and it's something that I talk about often, not only in the book Clean Meat, but also on a podcast that I host called Business for Good Podcast. We were very recently graced with the illustrious, venerable, prestigious presence of none other than Isha Datar, Executive Director of New Harvest, who had a great and very popular episode, one of the most downloaded episodes of all time. You'll be proud to know, Isha.
Nice. Awesome.
Yes, and I've been a fan and follower and cheerleader of cellular agriculture for a long time. In fact, the founder of New Harvest was my roommate at the time of the founding of the organization. So I feel like I go back to the beginning, even if I wasn't an active participant in it back then.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Unfortunately, I didn't bring any props. I don't have any merchandise to flash. Maybe I should develop my own and send it out to everybody.
Rookie mistake, Neil. Rookie mistake.
Never again. Anyway, on with the content. We're here to talk about the history of cellular agriculture. We generally dividing the session into sort of three components. We want to talk about just what happened just after the millennium. Then we want to spend a period talking about what's happened in more recently, since we've seen the emergence of a lot of startup companies. But we're also going to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the future as well, because you can't understand the past without the future, and you can't understand the future without the past. But before we get into the things that happened from the millennium on, you couldn't do a session like this without remembering that there is a prehistory to cellular agriculture, to cultured meat. So I'm going to rush through, or rush isn't the word, but swiftly cover a few points that are worthy of mentioning. I mean, in many ways, the history of the lab work of cultured meat is really just the history of cell culturing in general. There's a great deal of work done over the last 100 years that have been useful for people working in the community now, but many of them were not done with the idea of cultured meat as the desired endpoint. You know, people talk about Alexis Carrel's 1912 work, culturing embryonic heart muscle and keeping cells alive for 34 years. Many other instances in the emergence of biomedicine can also be a shared history. But there's also a more explicit history of people who are envisaging cultured meat and cellular agriculture. I'm going to list a few things, but I would like to point out actually that when I talk about this in the literature, I'm generally giving quite a sort of a Euro-American centric account. There could well be other visions from other cultures and other languages that I'm not familiar with. And if there are, it would be great if people could bring those to the discussion. But typically one of the earliest mentions is by a French scientist, Berthelot, who in 1894 is said to say that synthetic chemistry, so it's a different kind of technology, but it's still this envisaging that synthetic chemistry will allow people to make meat as we know it. There's quite a few accounts of people talking about how they think this is going to happen in the future. One of the more famous, one that was certainly circulated and talked about a lot over the last 10 or so years, is a quote from Winston Churchill in 1931. But there's also, prior to that, there's references in literature, in fiction. And I think these are also really important to take hold of in terms of how scientific narratives, but also fiction narratives frame what the issues are, frame what futures look like, and what the politics can be. So, and I should say most of this comes from the work of Warren Bolesko and John Miller, who are scholars that look at history and literary history. And they've identified an 1881 novel called Mirosa, A Prophecy by Mary Bradley Lane that talks about chemically prepared meat. And another one in 1897 called Two Planets that talks about automat sausage. They say that these early fiction works were interesting in that they were quite utopian. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but capturing the spirit of the time, they were really quite optimistic about what cultured meat and other technologies could produce. Whereas you then see another set of publications that came out from the 40s, 50s onwards, when there was quite a boom in science fiction. Things like The Space Merchants. I mean, that's one that people talk about the most, in 1952 by Poln and Kornbluth. There's a 1962 book called The Space Viking that talks about carniculture vats, right? Carniculture vats, that's really kind of on the line that we're talking about, someone called Bean Pipers. And Larry Niven's 1978 short book, Assimilating Our Culture, that's what they're doing. And these books generally are much more dystopian. It was the theme of science fiction at the time, to look at how science and technology and future science and technology could be an articulation, not so much of the problems of science, but of the problems of capitalism, and how capitalism, run wild to the extremes of consumerism through science and technology, could be very dehumanizing. So these are some of the sort of the early literary and prophetic mentions. But when we start talking about the people who have been doing stuff, the story normally often starts with Willem van Aelen, who was a Dutch entrepreneur who from the 50s, 60s, so the stories go, was thinking about cultured meat. And in the 90s started to look to work with people and filed a patent, the first patent in the area. And then after the millennium was actually core to a group that we'll be talking about in a moment. The first instances of people trying to make cultured meat are normally put down to one of two cases, Oran Katz and Yone Zer, who are bioartists who did a number of projects just after the millennium, and also NASA-funded work by Morris Benjaminson and a team at Truro College. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to start talking about their reflections on these early works and how they fed into what followed.
I'm taking your silence, Isha, as an invite for me to do it, but sure, I now take your nod and your thumbprint to do it. So, you know, if you look at the NASA research, this is conducted about 20 years ago. And of course, this is not the first time that anyone had conceived of doing this. As Neil mentioned, more than a century earlier, you had this French chemist, Berthelot, talking about actually growing meat without animals. And he didn't just predict it, he actually went further and talked about what type of a moral improvement this type of an advancement would cause. And I think it's worth just noting that he talked about how once, I'm reading from him right now, that once people no longer needed to wage war over limited resources or engage in the soul-crushing slaughter of beasts, their character will be increased in sweetness and nobility. And perhaps, Berthelot added, one fine day, synthetic or spiritual chemistry, as he called it, would even allow humans to alter their own moral nature, just as material chemistry had altered the conditions of our environment. And so it's pretty fascinating that it wasn't just a projection that this could happen or would happen, but it was actually a prediction that this could seriously solve serious problems that humanity was facing, like fighting wars over nature and natural resources and the inhumane treatment of animals. Well, you fast forward a century, and now the thought is, from those who could fund it, not that we would figure out how we could grow meat on Earth for the purpose of saving natural resources, but rather, how could we grow meat in space for the purpose of long-distance cosmic tourism? After all, we're not going to be, you know, if we're going to be traveling the stars or even traveling our solar system, we're not taking Noah's Ark in tow with us. If you want meat in space, you're going to have to grow it. And so NASA, preparing for that, funded this research about 20 years ago. And this was research in New York at Truro College. And what they found was that not only was it theoretically possible to grow meat outside of an animal, but they actually did it. They actually grew real fish muscle outside of a goldfish's body and increased the mass of that goldfish. And so they did fry it up. It did smell like fish. The FDA did not permit them to actually consume it, so it never actually got eaten. So the first cultured meat would not be eaten for many years later. But the point is that it was proven that this is not just something of 19th century science fiction novels, which I really want to read those books now. Neil, you've sparked my interest in going to read those, but that this was actually something that could be science fact. And it actually inspired a number of people to get involved in this space. Jason Matheny, the founder of New Harvest, credits this research to sparking his interest in it. And in fact, he wrote to every person, not just the authors, but also every person cited in that NASA paper, the paper from Benjaminson, asking them, why is nobody doing this on Earth? Why do this in space when we could do this on Earth? And the authors and those scientists cited responded to him saying, why would anybody want to do that on Earth? We already have soy burgers. And, you know, Matheny's point was, well, many people may not want soy burgers. Maybe they want what they consider the real thing, which is real meat, just without the animals. And that led to him co-authoring a paper on how to actually produce what he was calling in vitro meat. And that sparked this real revolution that spawned New Harvest and so many other endeavors into popularizing, both within academia and now within the for-profit space as well, the actual cultivation of animal cells to grow real animal products without animals. So in a very real way, that NASA research, I consider it like the genesis of the cultivated meat movement.
And if I can add a couple sentences here, Neil, I learned things just in your introduction right now. I didn't know all of that history or all of those kind of science fiction references. And I'm thinking like you, Paul, like maybe we should start a book club. It'd be awesome to kind of go through those and consider them and see how they can influence the future and so on. But Paul, I really loved how you kind of created some context for that history, mentioning Berthelot's kind of the moral sides of him talking about growing meat from chemistry, because it kind of makes me wonder how far the idea that eating meat is kind of a moral conundrum, like how far back does that go? And what is the kind of context for humans thinking that way? And, you know, I really appreciated, Neil, how you mentioned that we're kind of looking at this European Western lens, looking at history right now. But I did just want to shout out, you know, thousands of years ago, there are, you know, people, you know, often Buddhist or for other kind of religious reasons, working towards producing substitutes for meat, such as seitan and tofu. And, you know, while those things, you know, mentally we might characterize those things as plant-based, I still think that those are, you know, chemistry ways to replace meats, and they came from a moral place, and those decisions to create those alternatives came from a place. And so I think that that is also a really important context, just worth shouting out, which maybe also ties into the present day, where maybe we shouldn't be thinking about, you know, plant-based substitutes and cell cultured substitutes as that distinct, and that there's really a shared intention here of moving away from animal products in general.
Isha, I totally agree with you on many fronts. One, I'm eager to join this book club, so you let me know when we're getting started. I would be obsessed with reading 19th century novels that talk about this topic. Two, there is a great 20th century book. In fact, I think it's 21st century book called The Longest Struggle by Norm Phelps, which has a history of basically vegetarian and animal welfare thought going back thousands of years, both in Eastern and Western culture. And you're absolutely right. These aren't notions that are only centuries old. These are millennia old. And in fact, the very first ever recipe written down that anyone has found for plant-based meat comes from over a millennia ago in China. So more than 1,000 years ago, the Chinese were writing down recipes for how to make plant-based lamb in that particular case. And I think it would be a great book for somebody to write, a history of plant-based meat from ancient China to the Impossible Whopper. That would be a really cool arc, and you can look and see how that trajectory has occurred.
Yeah, my understanding actually is John Miller, who I mentioned earlier, is looking into the possibility of doing a book looking at the history of fictions around cultured meat. And I said it's from one of his papers that many of these references came. As well as the NASA work, there was, as I said, Yone Zaranoran-Katz's work, which was this bioarts project, which is quite different in that it was deliberately provocative. Disembodied Cuisine was the title of one of the two, to try to provoke thought on the politics and the philosophy of what it is, what meat is, and what it is to be people engaged in reconfiguring how something that's so familiar is being produced in a very different way. But I'm keen to keep us moving along and to talk a bit about some of the sort of mid-2000s work, which I think is really, really important in the story, in part in terms of why it was less successful than why it was successful. I don't know what other panelists will think, but for those who aren't familiar, there were a number of people, I know of examples in the States and in Europe, who were people who were primarily in academia, working in universities, who were trying to make cultured meat. And overwhelmingly, these were people who were either in veterinary science or cell culturing. And the cultured meat component in their work was primarily a side project. Rarely was it something that they were paid to do, and rarely was it something that they were able to do full time. There was a group in Sweden, for example, Julie Gold's group, who were looking at bioreactors, another group in Norway. Vladimir Mironov, who I think was one of the co-authors with Jason on the paper you mentioned earlier, Paul, was working in the States. The big grants at the time, the big people who had funding was called themselves the Dutch In Vitro Meat Consortium. The principal investigator was a guy called Henk Haagsman from Utrecht University of Utrecht. And he was working with Willem van Alen, the person I mentioned earlier, who was this sort of prophetic and really charismatic but quite determined individual who managed to bring together a collection of scientists at a number of Dutch universities and convince part of the Dutch government, not the part of the Dutch government that typically funds food research or typically funds cell culturing research, but a part that was focused, a short-lived part of the Dutch government that was focused on what they called the protein revolution. He convinced them to fund the consortium for about 3 or 4 years. It was essentially primarily for PhD studentships and a number of academic staff working on the project. The Dutch government also funded some edible insects work at the same time. And that consortium also included Peter Verstraete and Mark Post, who are now of Mosa Meats. Peter was the industry connection for the project. They were looking at trying to derive cell lines from embryos, and they were also looking at ways to stimulate cells electrically and mechanically to promote growth. I find them fascinating because they were trying to struggle with forming a framework for how we should understand cultured meat and how it should be politicized and supported and funded. And essentially their model for how it should be funded, which was university grants, was largely unsuccessful, with the exception of that Dutch grant. It was less successful all that time. I wonder if anyone else on the panel wants to comment on that earlier work and how they've seen that transitioning into where we are today.
I remember hearing about that earlier work and thinking, the 2 million euros that was given to that effort was not very much money for the size of this concept and the size of the work that you're going to do, and also to be collaborating with so many different universities and kind of different angles of the project. And so, something I reflect on is, why did that not become an immediate stepping stone to more government support right after? I don't have the answers for this, so I just think it's an interesting thing to consider. I think another interesting point worth mentioning, which I wish I remembered this person's name fully, but Mark Post was actually not one of the original researchers in that grant. It was a different researcher named maybe Carleen something. And so Mark actually joined after the grant had already started, which is something that I find interesting that he mentions in some of his talks, is that he kind of describes himself as like falling into the field, but then of course really running with it. So that's also an interesting little tidbit of how the field has kind of grown beyond the bounds of that initial grant. And I think it's really interesting also to see that the Netherlands was, one of the first funders of this work. I think it's kind of unsurprising when you think of the Netherlands as such a, small landmass, but highly agriculturally productive and innovative country, that this would be supported there and continues to be well supported there to this day.
In fact, it is so supported there that that Willem van Eeuwen's daughter, Ira van Eeuwen, has taken up the cause, and the apple didn't fall far from the tree at all. She has been a passionate crusader for advancing her father's ideals and her father's work. And I'm very impressed by the work that she's done, traveling, writing, giving speeches, seeking more governmental grants. She actually wrote the foreword to the Dutch version of Clean Meat, the book Clean Meat also, and to the German edition of it too. So she really has been a real pioneer, waging her father's war in his absence. So hat off to Ira van Eeuwen. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would only also say about that is, like, it showed that at the beginning how important corporate relationships were, because when Willem van Eeuwen wanted to get this funding, to get that government grant, he needed a corporate sponsor of the work to work with him. And he went to Sara Lee, where Peter Verstraete, now the CEO of Mosa Meat, but then was working at Sara Lee in the Netherlands. And Peter, talks about this unannounced visit that he got from this eccentric old man who came into his office with no meeting, no call in advance, just said, "I want to talk to you about this." And that led to quite a partnership. And, now, a couple decades later, you look at what it has spawned and how that chance meeting changed Peter's life in a pretty dramatic way. In fact, Peter gave me the internal notes on his meeting with Willem van Eeuwen that he and his colleagues, the memos from Sara Lee that they circulated throughout the company back then, which are in the book Clean Meat also. So you just never know how the trajectory of history is going to be altered by something that you have no idea. You walk into your office one day and somebody walks in, and the next thing you know, you're going to be changing your career. So pretty interesting chance, a stroke of history there.
Yeah, absolutely. Cultured meat, cellular agriculture is, I think it's fair to say, it's a community that has some strong characters. There's some people who are very charismatic. There are some people who are very determined. Willem van Aelen was at the top of that. He was having been lucky enough to have spent some time with him, he was an enormous character, full of ideas and energy, and very driven, and could be very charismatic. But I think it's also fair to say that if he wanted to be, he could be very determined, and could possibly wasn't always the easiest person to get along with if he didn't want to be. If he felt that to see his goals, it was best suited to pressure people a little, he was perfectly comfortable to do that. And I think that's a big part of why the Netherlands. But I also think a part of the story for why the grant wasn't continued is really to do with the status of what cultured meat was at the time, as this sort of unknown, highly novel concept, substance that didn't really fit the existing categories around which government and university funding bodies organized themselves. It wasn't really food as the way that the people who funded food saw it. It wasn't really cell culturing and biomedicine in the way that people who fund that imagine their mission. So it kind of didn't sit comfortably with those categorizations. But you mentioned Peter, you've both mentioned Mark Post, and you know what to me, I know not everyone agrees with this, but what to me was still really possibly the most important or most defining moment in the history of the community, as I say, I know not everyone agrees with that, but that's my take, was their burger, the burger that they produced in 2013, which was tasted at a press conference, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Isha, I know you were there, you were in post at the time. Perhaps you'd like to tell us about how you remember the burger coming into being and how you understand its impact.
Yes, the burger was definitely a milestone, like in a global sense and from a media perspective. And it was, you know, at the time I didn't know a lot about how it came together. And I think I was under an impression that I think some of the media intended to put out into the world, that, you know, we can make this stuff and it is going to be in grocery stores anytime soon. And I feel like some of that actually needed to be unpacked a little bit. I think in some ways the visual of seeing the burger and tasting it was a little bit different than seeing the video about how it was produced from the myotubes and so on. And then the disconnect being like, what is actually required in between those two things to make this a reality for all of us, and to see the impact that we want this burger to truly have on the world in terms of, you know, reducing animal suffering, reducing environmental impact, and so on. So I remember that being a big takeaway for me, is how do we bridge that gap, which I think is like a gap towards reality and like true change in the world. But on the other hand, after the burger, it felt like you didn't have to explain the idea of growing meat from cells as much. It wasn't immediately after, you know, it was probably a year after, and I had met countless people who had heard about this concept through all kinds of random media mentions. I remember I met a researcher in South Africa who mentioned that he learned about the idea of growing meat from cells because he was watching a game show, and the game show question was, what is the most expensive burger in the world? And it was that burger. And he's like, oh, that's so interesting. And he was a muscle science researcher, and so he learned about it. So anyway, yes, there was a lot of ripple effects in terms of building awareness just around that burger. And I think that the biggest piece of data that connected the reality of the burger with, you know, the idea of having it on store shelves was that price tag. And so I think that the price tag on that burger was a really, really important piece of data that I think planted some of the seeds of us thinking about what it would take to make this truly accessible for everybody. But I have to say, I was so excited to be there. I remember staying at a tiny little, what is it called? I can't even remember. It was, wow, I can't remember what it's called, but it was like a little hotel kind of thing, and walking all the way there and just being at the beginning of my kind of professional career in cell ag too, because I had only started with New Harvest full-time a couple of months prior. So it was a really big deal for me personally, and it was awesome to see it become a big deal for the world at that time too.
And And I'm very envious, Isha, that you were there, because I followed the news of it from across the pond in America with great enthusiasm and excitement. And I was one of those people who knew enough to know how and why this was happening, but not enough to know that commercialization wasn't imminent. And so at that time, I thought, oh, wow, cool. Well, this could be happening. Two fun facts, though, about this little piece of history. One, many people perceive this as the burger, when in reality there were actually two burgers that were there, not just one, and that Mark had made two of them. It reminded me of, in the movie Contact, do you remember when they built the second one of these machines? Because the first rule of government spending is, why have one when you can have two for twice the price? So anyway, so there were two burgers, and my favorite thing, the thing that I hear the most about from anybody who's read the book Clean Meat, is that they love this story where Mark has the two burgers in his lab and they are ready to go, but he needs to get from the Netherlands to London. He's going to be taking a train in the morning because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to get it on an airplane for some biosecurity reasons. So he's in his lab and he decides he's such an environmentalist that he's not even going to take a cab or drive. He's going to put them in a cardboard box and get on his bicycle and bike home from his workplace at the university to his home with multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars in a little cardboard box on his bike. No insurance, no nothing, just hundreds of thousands of dollars in his entire culmination of his life's work right there. And he bikes home, and he's got people filming him while he's biking home. You can see video of this, of him biking home. Of course, it happens to be one of the hottest days that year in the Netherlands, so he's concerned that the burgers might actually spoil. Fortunately, it was a very short bike ride. He got home, put it in his refrigerator, was concerned that his children might actually look in the box in the fridge if they go to get some OJ and say, oh, burgers, cool. So he had to put a sign on it, and then they essentially smuggled it in via train to the UK. And the rest, of course, is history. And I think that all of us owe people like Mark and Peter and those who led that project a tremendous debt of gratitude, because what they did was they inspired all these people to realize that this is real, that this can be done. And it wasn't just something that was a fantasy anymore, but something that really could be done. And I really believe that Uma Valetti, who ended up co-founding the first for-profit company, Memphis Meats, or at the first initially called Krevy Meats, was really inspired by that thought that if Mark could do this, why not try to actually commercialize it? And so Uma, who had been serving on the board of directors of New Harvest, ends up going from funding academic work in the space to also creating his own company. And I don't doubt that Mark's work on that burger, or those burgers, was a direct causal effect on that.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the burger was important because it kind of solidified a set of ideas that had been floating around what the technology, how it should be understood and what it might accomplish. But it made it in a form that became recognizable, that became sort of coherent in a way. I mean, you can unpick it, but it was at least presented as a coherent package. And as you've both said, it was something that became a referencing point that you couldn't really get away from for a number of years. So it was the thing to talk about, just as the Winston Churchill quote had been used so regularly prior to that and a little bit afterwards.
Can I add 2 cents?
Yeah.
Yes. One thing is that the second burger, for those who are interested in the fate of the second burger, is currently at the Boerhaave Museum in Leiden. So if you're interested in seeing it, it's there. It's been plastinated, which is like an interesting technique for preserving biological things. So you can check it out there. I haven't seen it in person. I've seen photos. So that's a cool thing. And then the second thing that I'll just flag is I do think it's kind of interesting that the prototype that was created over in the Netherlands was a hamburger, which is such an American symbol, as opposed to, a meatball, which is a very, very Dutch symbol, or maybe a sausage or something like that. And so there's a kind of an interesting context in terms of that decision to use that product. And maybe that context is to some degree like a universal idea that we put meat between pieces of bread and eat it.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, what Mark told me about that was that he wanted to do a sausage. That was the original idea. But that Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, who was funding the research, said he wanted it to be a burger.
Yes, yeah.
Money talks.
Yeah.
yeah. I have been to the museum to see it, and it's interesting to see. I don't know if one should say such a thing, but actually it's a little bit slightly underwhelming actually, because you know, I traveled to the country. It was actually on the way to Mark's conference in Maastricht, but I traveled to the city to see it, and it looks like a little plastic pink disc, kind of, you know, it's a lot smaller. I mean, I was also at the event where they tasted them, and again there you couldn't see it because I was sat too far away, but it's very interesting to see it, but at the same time it wasn't as profound as I thought it may be. I took lots of photos. Time's moving on very quickly. We've got to move to questions quite soon, but I would like to give each of you an opportunity to give your reflections on what you've both mentioned it. What happened subsequently when around 2015 we saw the beginning of companies coming into the space, and I think that was quite important for changing certainly the economic framing, but also changing the way that people were acting and talking about what was going to happen in the future and when it was going to happen in the future. So you've both been very close to this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the first set of companies.
I can speak to that first. I think the biggest realization that happened for me after the burger was tasted was that we did, you know, in all these historical mentions, we talk about replacing meat, but really the construction of the tools to replace meat could be used to replace all kinds of products. And it seemed very necessary that we actually think of this as a toolbox or a field of research or a discipline or a study. And so the naming of the field cellular agriculture was really, really important in terms of drawing some kind of loose boundaries around this idea that we are developing the technologies to replace meat, but also the technologies to replace milk and eggs, and perhaps even, you know, plant tissues or any kind of other kind of agricultural product using these cell cultures. And the reason why I think that that was so important is because it's by opening up the field, you develop a lot of technologies that maybe are not directly relevant to meat production, but would help meat production in the long run. And furthermore, it was also important to kind of expand scope into the history of other products that were created with cell cultures, such as insulin and rennet for cheese making, which are very important pioneering products for cellular agriculture and the idea of replacing animal products in general. So that the naming of that field is really important. And just to give like very detailed background, that happened in our New Harvest Facebook group. I remember we were posting, we should name this field. It's so much more than this. What would it be called if it was an academic discipline? What would it be called if you're trying to get a major in university in this topic? And so it kind of originated from all this community discussion, which is a really lovely thing to have witnessed. And then afterwards, I actually can't remember if it was afterwards or before. No, before, Perfect Day Foods was kind of one of the early stage companies that emerged, which I kind of think of as the first cellular agriculture company proper. Not to discount the work of the rennet and the insulin stuff, but I feel like to some degree, Perfect Day Foods was tackling this very major commodity animal product using cell culturing technologies. And they were doing, they have a very big story, a lot of really transformative tech. And I think to some degree, they really wedged the door open in terms of the idea of producing meat from cell culture being more and more reasonable and more likely to be a for-profit entity type of venture. So between Perfect Day Foods being founded in 2014, and then Clara Foods shortly thereafter, I think we really planted the seeds of, okay, this is not science fiction anymore. This is real stuff that can happen in the lab and is going to be tackling a huge problem and might make money in the process, very likely will make money in the process. And I think to some degree, they kind of planted the seeds for Memphis Meats getting started the next year and really inspiring others to engage fully with the idea of becoming entrepreneurs in the space. And I think that has really led to the explosion of companies in cellular agriculture since. Last time I counted, there's 83 cultured meat companies, not even the other food products. So yeah, very catalytic time.
I cannot let it stand and have Isha say that this all happened in a Facebook group, because she is the one who made the suggestion of calling it cellular agriculture in that Facebook group. So
in the Facebook group, it was a collective inspiration.
Collective inspiration with one person, Isha Datar, who actually made the suggestion of it. So Isha named the field cellular agriculture. She also is the co-founder of these companies like Clara Foods and Perfect Day. So I don't think it's possible to overestimate the impact that she's had on that catalytic time, not just as a independent observer, but as an active participant in it. So I would say that, certainly insulin and rennet, and also luciferase, which I think is a far less discussed topic, but, for decades, literally tens of millions of fireflies were collected and sent to Sigma Chemical Corporation so that they could have luciferase extracted from their bodies for use in biotech. And then once it was synthesized through microbial fermentation, similar to what Perfect Day is doing, back in the early 90s, that harvest or slaughter of tens of millions of these fireflies stopped because of that. So already it's not just that companies like Perfect Day and Clara Foods have the promise of doing an enormity of good in the world. Already this type of technology has done an enormity of good, surely for diabetics, but also in this case for populations of fireflies. Who, by the way, are not flies. They are beetles, for what it's worth, in case you are interested in entomology. But one of the things that I have been most impressed by since then is just how much money has come into the space. I would say if you look from, let's say, Berthollet's time in 1894 to, probably, let's say, like 2010, my guess is that the amount of money that had been spent on this type of research was in the single digits millions. So you had the Netherlands money, the NASA money, and nearly nothing else. So single digit millions. And now if you look from, let's say, 2010 to 2020, you're talking about literally hundreds of millions of dollars that have poured into companies like Perfect Day and Memphis Meats. Mm-hmm. And it's a truly an explosion, and it's meaning that it's attracting many students, many tissue engineers, many people who really want to make a big difference in the world, but also want to make some money to get into the space and realize that doing good in the world doesn't have to be divorced from doing well for yourself also. And that, I think, has been part of the explosion of interest in the venture capital community and the entrepreneurial community and getting more involved in this. And then the IPO of Beyond Meat is just supercharged that, showing that alternative protein companies actually can succeed in the marketplace, lets people know that this is serious business and that there are really fundamental challenges that we as a species have to solve with regard to sustainably feeding ourselves today and into the future. And cellular agriculture can be a very important component of that process. As Isha mentions, it's not the only solution, but just in the same way that we have lots of different alternatives to factory farming, just to say we have lots of alternatives to fossil fuels, wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear, and so on. We want lots of alternatives to factory farming, whether it's cellular agriculture, plant-based meat, hybridized meats, microbial fermentation, and so on. You want lots of different alternatives to this problem that we're trying to solve.
And Paul, I'll just add a little more detail to your number, because Cell Agri just put out their industry report this month in October, and they calculated that over $1 billion have gone just into cell ag food companies. So that's excluding your Bolt Threads and your Modern Meadow and the biomaterials and the other stuff. Just the food companies have attracted over $1 billion of investment in the past 10 years.
Incredible. Thank you both. It's come to the time for us to move on to questions. We didn't get as much time to talk about the future as I'd like to, but maybe that will come through in the questions. I believe Alex is going to join us to help us moderate at this point.
Yes, thank you for a really great discussion. I think I've definitely learned a lot of kind of holes that have been filled in terms of understanding what is going on. We have some questions that we'll get to in a second. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. and then we'll pass them over. There is a question. I will answer it, or I will read. It says, since the true pioneers of this new technology are not always the most famous personalities on the topic, maybe the future reference personality on cultivated meat does not exist yet, or are we already far enough? Kind of a little bit more of a comment, but any thoughts on, maybe there's more to come, anything like that?
I definitely think there's more to come. And I'm thinking of it from the perspective of, we fund academic researchers, and only a couple years ago did we support the first PhD student who is kind of designated a cellular agriculture PhD. We're going to have a first student who pursues cellular agriculture from undergrad and does like a cellular agriculture dedicated program. I think we're also going to start seeing people make real transformative, what we call in the New Harvest team, research quantum leaps that are things that we can't see yet today. I mean, we're leveraging technology that is kind of new in itself. Like tissue culture is not brand new, but a lot of the methods that I think are being used today are not, radically, changing the game. I think that those game-changing things are still to come. The things that really bring costs down in a meaningful way, or really scale up in a meaningful way, or perhaps allow cells to be fed really inexpensive media, whatever. So those things, I think the people who discover those things are going to be really transformative pieces of this puzzle.
Yeah, I would just suggest that the space is no longer embryonic, but it is still definitely in its infancy. I mean, let's just keep in mind that 0 grams of cultivated meat have ever been sold anywhere on the planet. So as enthusiastic as we are, we should also have a reality check. In fact, perhaps the most successful companies in this space haven't even yet been founded. I talk to people who say, oh, I'm thinking about starting a company, but this company is already doing this, so I don't want to do that. Well, there's room in the world for McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's, despite the fact that they're all basically fast food burger joints, right? So certainly there's room in the world for lots of companies in this space as well. And some of them will succeed, some of them will fail, some of them have already failed. I mean, some companies that have founded no longer exist. I mean, there's already been like mortality in this space for some of the startups. So, but my suggestion is that the future is very long for this field, and that it requires more people getting involved now. And perhaps some of the biggest pioneers in this space don't even know that they're going to be in this space yet.
Yeah, I certainly agree. There's a long future. Oh,
I was just going to say, maybe they haven't even been born yet.
Yeah, but I think it's also quite viable that if the technology does go on to be successful, that the companies that sell the most volume might be companies that exist but haven't yet got involved, because those companies could well be buying out some of the more successful companies, or forming partnerships with some of the more successful companies that are around at the moment, or maybe formed in the next few years. And I do think that will be quite significant, not just in changing the personalities of who is the most well-known people, but also possibly the framing, the economics and the politics around the technology could well shift as ownership shifts if it's successful. If it's successful, it has to.
And actually, Neil, I really like that point that you brought up. And I think that that's actually something we need to think about as a field right now. A lot of the people who have jumped into this field recently are really interested in that moral question and the idea of moving away from eating animals because of what it can do for humanity and for people on the planet. But as this business becomes more viable, we may see entrepreneurs enter the field for completely different motivations. And so to some degree, I'm becoming more and more interested to create some accountability in the field, so that these products actually do the good things that they promise to do, like actually are better for the environment, actually do reduce the amount of animals we need to farm. And this is the kind of stuff we need to establish with this kind of version 1.0 cohort before it starts growing into like purely capitalistic things and starts looking more and more like the science fiction books that you mentioned very, very at the beginning of this conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe we should get another question, because I can see that they're coming in and time is ticking.
Yeah, we have an interesting question from Luke, who asks, what are some of the mistakes that were made early on in the field, and what lessons could we have learned from those mistakes?
Okay, that's a very challenging question, and I said earlier that I felt that the group of people who were working in the 10 years after the millennium were generally unsuccessful in that they didn't get the money that they got. But I don't necessarily think they were unsuccessful due to errors that they made. I don't think that they were necessarily making the wrong choices. I think that the context to support the development of institutions, the flowing of funds, and actually to a certain extent the science base as well. A lot of cellular agriculture has benefited from innovations that have happened in biomedicine over the last 20 years, which were not available to people working in 2004, 2005. So, I mean, someone could come up with a radically different take and say that people should have been trying to make sort of venture-backed startups in 2005. But I'm not sure that the moment was right to succeed in much more than the people at the time did succeed, if you think what they did was successful. I don't know if anyone else has a comment.
I think it's hard. I think the field is so young that it's hard to point at something that seems like a mistake. I think that, there could have been distractions or things that feel like mistakes in the short term, but in the long term, maybe they're the opposite of mistakes and they ignite a certain line of thinking that kind of transforms the field in a meaningful way. But I think one thing that was, actually, I think there's also probably mistakes that we will never know because they're about people's decisions to enter the field and they decided not to enter the field. So it's kind of hard to gauge it as a mistake. But I think one missed opportunity was a direct call to action from the hamburger about what the world needs to look like in order for these products to truly exist. I wish there was kind of a little bit more of, we need to see institutes, we need to see a vibrant economy, we need to see an industry. And I think if that picture were painted a little bit better, I think there would have been a better way to kind of capture all this interest that came out after the hamburger. I think I don't know if it was a mistake or a missed opportunity or just like a series of factors that happened, but I would have loved to see Sergey Brin continue supporting after that burger was debuted, because it was kind of like a high and then this drop off where we didn't have clear next funders to go to or clear kind of next steps to continue the work. And, I'm shouting out to Sergey, like, we need you back to support this work again.
No doubt he's watching this this panel right now, and so I only for you, Sergey, I'm echoing Isha's comment here. We need you back. For you, your wealth fluctuates probably about $1 billion up and down over the year anyway. So, what's another billion just to invest in this space? No big deal.
Great, and Sergey says, "Thanks for the shout out, Paul." We have another question from Johannes, who says, "Thanks for the great presentation. On the topic of people in space, what role do you think social science and qualitative research can play in developing the understanding of cellular agriculture now and in the future?"
Shall I go first? As I call myself a social scientist. I think there's a huge amount of space for social science here. I think it's important to recognize how diverse social science is. It can mean so many different things. I know a lot of social scientists, some do quite similar stuff to me. A lot of them do something that's really quite different. I'm keen to see more critically engaged social science that raises difficult questions about cellular agriculture, to try to improve the kinds of accountability that Isha talked a little bit about earlier, to try to increase the openness and, well, not really, kind of the openness, but to keep the debate in a way that can be critical but also informed and not necessarily sort of sensationalist, because I do think that the community will see a greater number of people who find it problematic and are active in trying to challenge cellular agriculture from all kinds of different reasons. We already see some of this. I think that will increase. And I hope that social science can be an important part of making critical debates evidence-based and thoughtful and reflexive and aware of broader complex sort of political ecologies. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
I want to echo what you're saying, Neil, but add a little bit more. You know, cellular agriculture is incredibly complex. The technology is very, very complex, but also bringing that technology into the world is very complex, and the interactions it has with the world is crazy. And, you know, when I think about cellular agriculture, I think the thing that gets me most excited about it is this idea that we have a completely radical new technology that can allow us to go back to the drawing board for so many things. Like, we're going back to the drawing board around animal products, but we could also re-envision new ways of distribution, new supply chains, new ways of actually delivering food to the world, new ways of people owning that food, owning that IP, creating systems of accountability. You know, what are the rights of the people developing cellular agriculture products? And so I like to think, you know, the obvious impacts we think about for these products are, it's better for animals, we don't need them anymore, there's an environmental component. But I really do encourage people in this field to think about how can we introduce essentially a new food system that's better for so many things beyond that really affect people, the people who work in agriculture and the people who consume agricultural products. And I think that's where social scientists play a role, is to some degree envisioning these various futures of cell ag in the world and really telling the stories of how this could be manifested in the world. And I think, you know, a big role I'd like to see social scientists play going forward is, how do we place this technology within cultural contexts that are not just kind of the Western ones we focused on in, you know, the recent past, because there's a lot of impact, there's a lot of kind of different ways of envisioning these products being delivered that can come from just completely different cultural mindsets, completely different ways of approaching food and food production. And so I am really, really kind of pumped about the next few years of social science research, because I agree with you, Neil, there's a lot of hard questions to be asked, but there's a lot of new futures to be imagined as well.
I totally agree with all of that. And I also want to say, I just read through, there's like a dozen other questions, all of which are quite intriguing. So I know that we're running out of time. I don't want to speak for my esteemed co-panelists, but if you want to contact me to ask me anything, you can get in touch with me through the website cleanmeat.com. Tim and Carol, your messages came in at the beginning at the very same time, so I'm going to send you both copies of Clean Meat. Everybody else, you can just go to Amazon and get your own. But I'm really grateful, Neil, to you for chairing our panel here. It was a fun conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for being involved. I think we're delivering our panel on time. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching. I saw a question about sharing the list of books. I think I'll try to do that. There's a stream where we're typing about this, right? Anita, I'm sure, can update us on how we continue discussion after this.